Hello again, Kingpin here, and today there's a particularly important issue that's going to be affecting most of us, and that is the MBT rebalance. So this is going to be another two-part video. I've decided to split it up into two halves. The first half is going to be looking at the MBT previously in the previous test, and what its issues were and how it performed. The next video is going to be looking at the MBT in the upcoming test. I'll get a lot of footage of that. Hopefully it'll be of higher quality than the one you're seeing now, and I'll be able to give my thoughts on that and see where it's at. Allow me to just briefly explain the issues with the MBTs and why they had to be rebalanced, which good on Obsidian for picking this up quickly, because this was a big issue. MBTs were not given any special abilities, unlike the other classes of tanks. They simply have good armor, decent mobility, not great, decent, and usually pretty good guns. They may not be accurate, but they have good alpha. So that was considered generally enough for them. They didn't have to receive anything else, and I generally agree with that assessment. Well, in this previous test, they didn't really have the armor. They had the guns, they had the mobility, but they had no armor. Give you an example, the T-62, which is supposed to be at the brawling line, you don't have all MBTs brawling, but the Russians were supposed to be brawling tanks, right? The T-62 had about 100 millimeters of hull armor. Even at a 60-degree angle, you would still not only penetrate the hull, you would over-penetrate and do less damage, which should only be happening against a lightly armored vehicle. But it happens because on the Patton's gun, or whatever gun you're using, you have like 300, 400 pen, something in that range, and it's against 100 millimeters. So yeah, that's like really, really high over-penetration. These ammo types are designed to, force you to change depending on what you're firing at, but against an MBT, you would think you should be firing AP, and you would be reserving heat for something like AFVs, like tanks, and stuff like that. Well, not so in this previous test. Unfortunately, the ammo types didn't quite work out the way they were supposed to, and I'll get into that later. But more importantly, the MBTs didn't have enough armor to actually go and brawl. The result was that AFVs could chew them up, high explosive, and furthermore, the tanks which were supposed to be good at brawling, like the Russians, weren't very good at brawling because they couldn't take the hits, and they didn't have as much health as stuff like the Patton and the Leopard. The Leopard was actually better because it had more health. So this created a number of issues. It kind of made it felt like they weren't really heavy tanks, and for the most part, people just sat back and sniped with them, which has contributed to the problem of camping in this game. So you can see that this is actually a fairly important issue, creating camping. So good on Obsidian for fixing this. Let's just hope that these fixes end up being the right choice. So, in case you're a little bit confused, the three ammo types that we're talking about here are Heat, High Explosive, and Armor Piercing. Heat is also referred to as Shaped Charge. This is supposed to be used against lightly armored vehicles or the weak side armor of MBTs, and this does generally more damage but less pen. So basically, kind of like High Explosive back in World of Tanks. The issue with shaped charges is that they don't quite work. You have scenarios where the shaped charge will hit like a piece of spaced armor, such as tracks, or it'll just hit the front of a vehicle, and even though it should have enough pen to go through, it just doesn't, because it's unreliable. Now, I don't know if this should stay in game as it is, but I would think that if you're trying to have dynamic ammo type choices, choosing an ammo type which is highly unreliable would seem to be more of a detriment than choosing an ammo type which won't do as much damage, especially with the overmatch on AP, but is reliable, since you know what's going to happen and you're not going to have any kind of, bullshit scenarios like what would happen in World of Tanks, where your shot would just not go through, even though you really know that it should. Now, Armor Piercing is designed to go up against heavily armored tanks. You don't want to use it against lightly armored tanks because this overpenetration does less damage. Ideally, armor penetration rounds should not be overpenetrating on MBTs, even if it's a side or rear armor, because they're heavy tanks. They're designed to be what you use AP against. That is the intent of having these different ammo types, is that you have to switch them up depending on what you're facing. Finally, High Explosive, which had a few issues. It kind of worked for the most part. It wasn't that useful in the main guns, and it was useful on stuff like the 10P, which people complained about a lot, but the 10P really wasn't that overpowered. Basically, it was supposed to give AFV drivers, and also kind of light tank drivers, something to do when they couldn't flank. They could still put pressure on MBTs, but they could only put enough pressure on them if they didn't move. So the MBTs would have had to stay in place and just take the punishment to the face, because the high explosive rounds would go through their armor. It would bleed through the armor, it wouldn't do full damage. Unfortunately, the damage bleed off wasn't good enough, and tanks like the BMP-2 were able to get 4,000 or 5,000 damage in a game, using nothing but high explosive rounds and just shredding MBTs. So ideally, they would be able to do some damage, but not 5,000 damage. Not without switching to armor piercing and flanking and doing all that stuff that you would expect, or using high explosive shells against other AFBs and potentially light tanks. That's what it should be used for. The results of all of these mechanics coinciding together is that main battle tanks are basically encouraged to sit in sniping positions, and this creates a camping issue which many people have noticed and have complained about. And good on them for complaining about it, since we don't want this to be a camping game. Armored Warfare is supposed to be much more dynamic and supposed to be much more interesting than World of Tanks. There's supposed to be more going on with faster matches, and with MBTs being the way that they used to be, that was not happening. Especially on Ghost Fields, that northern corridor, all camping, all MBTs. It was suicide to go out there in an MBT, because all you had basically was health. You couldn't actually deflect shots reliably. So this results in even weirder situations where the Russian heavies, which are supposed to brawl, can't actually effectively brawl because they don't have the armor to do it, but the Leo has more health. And as such, since health matters more, the Leo is actually a better brawler than the Russian heavies, which doesn't make any sense at all, because the Leo has no armor. It wasn't supposed to brawl. Not like MBTs brawled in real life anyway, but you get what I'm saying. It couldn't take shots at all, and yet in this game, the Leo is actually better in city situations than most other tanks, because it has the health. Not just in city situations, in all situations. It can perform breakthrough tactics because it has the health, whereas other tanks, which can do the same thing, can't do them as well, because, again, health is more important than armor. Armor doesn't really matter. Later tiers, you can clearly see that armor matters more, but earlier tiers, tier 3, tier 4, partly tier 5, I didn't really get to experience tier 5 too much, you can definitely tell that there's an issue. And that it becomes plainly obvious after having played at tier 3 and tier 4 in these MBTs, which you had to because they were the things that you were going to get first, that there was definitely an issue going on, and I think that this is a good move to reduce the penetration, because a lot of people are going to be complaining that their shots aren't going to be penning, but this is how it's supposed to be. They're not supposed to be able to just go through all the time. You need to develop tactics, there needs to be an interesting game flow going on. So prepare for the rage posts that we're going to see on the forums about how shells never go through. Just remember how it used to be. It used to be terrible. So even if these new changes don't quite work out, I think that they're going to be a step in the right direction. So that's my rant for now. I'll see you guys in the next test with another video.